Sometimes life has to strip away everything you thought you had before. It can show you what you were meant to find. For single father Eli Mercer, losing his factory job felt like the final blow in a series of defeats that left him wondering how he'd keep food on the table for his young son. When he inherited a rundown cabin from a grandfather he never knew, everyone in town shook their heads in pity. Just another dead end for a man who couldn't catch a break. But beneath that rotting cabin lay a secret that had been waiting 300 years. A massive samurai armor worth nearly $200 million, buried by a mysterious Japanese warrior who crossed an ocean to hide his fortune in the American wilderness. Now Eli faces a new problem. When word spreads about the discovery, he realizes the real treasure isn't the gold. It's protecting his family from those who'll kill to claim it. What happens when a man who's lost everything suddenly has everything to lose? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Eli Mercer received the call about his grandfather's death, he was standing in line at the unemployment office, holding a crumpled piece of paper with job listings he'd already applied to twice. The woman on the phone spoke with the practiced efficiency of someone who delivered news about strangers' deaths for a living. "Mr. Mercer, this is Patricia Whitman from Whitman Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of your grandfather, Harold Mercer." Eli shifted the phone to his other ear, watching his 12-year-old son Danny kick at a loose piece of linoleum in the corner of the waiting room. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. My grandfather died when I was 5. "No, sir. This would be your paternal grandfather, Harold Mercer of Millbrook, Maine. He passed last week, and according to his will, you're his sole heir." The words felt foreign in Eli's mouth as he repeated them. Sole heir. He'd never heard of Harold Mercer, never knew his father had a living parent tucked away in the woods of Maine. His father had been a man of few words and fewer explanations before he'd walked out when Eli was 17. 2 weeks later, Eli found himself driving a borrowed pickup truck up a winding dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. Danny pressed against the passenger window, fogging the glass with his excited breathing. "Dad, look at all these trees," Danny said, his voice filled with the kind of wonder that only children could muster for ordinary things. "It's like we're driving into a fairy tale." Eli smiled, despite his exhaustion. Danny had always been like that, finding magic in the mundane, seeing adventure where others saw only problems. It was a gift Eli envied, especially now when everything felt like a burden too heavy to carry. The road narrowed until branches scraped against the truck's sides, and just when Eli thought they'd taken a wrong turn, the trees opened up to reveal a small clearing. In the center sat a cabin that looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. The structure sagged under the weight of decades, its roof patched with mismatched shingles, and its porch held up by what appeared to be prayer and stubbornness. Paint peeled from the siding in long strips, revealing weathered wood underneath that had turned silver gray from exposure. "This is it?" Danny asked, his voice smaller now. Eli turned off the engine and sat in the sudden silence, studying the building that was now, technically, his home. "This is it." They climbed out of the truck, and Eli felt the weight of the forest around them, the kind of deep, ancient quiet that made city dwellers uncomfortable. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, with an undertone of something he couldn't identify, something old. The front door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty rooms beyond. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that leaked through gaps in the curtains. The furniture was sparse and functional, a table that had seen decades of meals, chairs worn smooth by use, a stone fireplace that dominated one wall like a mouth frozen mid-yawn. "It smells like old people," Danny observed, not unkindly. "It smells like a life lived," Eli corrected, running his fingers along the mantelpiece. Family photos stood in a neat row, their faces obscured by years of dust. He picked up one frame and wiped it clean with his sleeve. The photograph showed a man who looked remarkably like Elisam, strong jaw, same deep-set eyes, same way of holding his shoulders, as if carrying invisible weight. But there was something else in the older man's face, a kind of watchful intensity that Eli had never seen in his own mirror. "Is that great-grandpa?" Danny asked, standing on his tiptoes to see. "I guess it is." Eli studied the image, searching for some recognition, some family connection that might explain why this stranger had left him his entire world. "I never met him." They spent the rest of the day exploring rooms that held a lifetime of accumulated solitude. In the bedroom, clothes still hung in the wardrobe, practical flannel shirts and wool pants, all in earthy colors that wouldn't show dirt. The kitchen held dishes, for one, a single coffee cup by the sink that Eli found himself reluctant to move. But it was in the study that Eli felt the first real stirring of curiosity about the man who'd lived here. The walls were lined with books, not just novels and almanacs, but volumes on Japanese history, martial arts, and something called The Way of the Warrior. Maps covered one entire wall, some modern, others that looked hand-drawn, with notations in what might have been Japanese characters. Danny pulled a book from the shelf. "Dad, why did great-grandpa have all these books about samurai?" Before Eli could answer, something fell from between the Pagesha photograph of the same man from the mantelpiece, but younger, wearing what looked like military dress uniform. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "Harold Mercer, 1950, 3, Tokyo Station." "Maybe he was in the war," Eli said, though the photograph raised more questions than it answered. His grandfather would have been quite young in 1953, barely older than Eli was now. As afternoon faded to evening, they made a simple dinner from supplies they'd brought, eating by the light of kerosene lamps when the ancient electrical system proved unreliable. The cabin felt enormous around them, full of corners that the lamplight couldn't reach, and sounds that might have been settling wood or might have been something else entirely. "Dad," Danny said as they prepared for bed on an air mattress in the main room, "do you think great-grandpa was lonely here?" Eli looked around at the tidy, solitary space. "I think he chose to be alone. That's different from being lonely." "How?" "Well, being lonely means you want company but don't have it. Choosing to be alone means you're comfortable with yourself. You don't need other people to feel complete." Danny considered this with the seriousness he brought to all philosophical discussions. "Were you lonely before Mom died?" The question caught Eli off guard, as his son's observations often did. "No, buddy. I had you and Mom. We were a family." "And now?" Eli pulled the sleeping bag up to Danny's chin, tucking him in the way he had every night since his wife Sarah's death 3 years ago. "Now I have you. That's enough." But lying in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest, Eli wondered if that was entirely true. He'd been so focused on survival, keeping food on the table, keeping Danny in school, keeping them both moving forward, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have a future worth planning for. The cabin groaned around them, settling into the kind of deep quiet that only comes in places far from civilization. Somewhere in the walls, something scurried, mice, probably, or squirrels. Normal sounds of a building that had stood empty for too long. But as Eli finally drifted towards sleep, he could have sworn he heard something else. The soft whisper of pages turning, as if someone in the study was reading by candlelight. Searching through those books about warriors and honor and ancient ways of living. In the morning, he would tell himself it had been a dream, a product of exhaustion and stress and the strangeness of sleeping in a dead man's house. But some part of him would remember that sound and wonder what his grandfather had been looking for in all those books about Japan. The answer, he would discover, was hidden in a place where no casual observer would think to look. But that discovery was still days away, waiting for a 12-year-old boy's curiosity to uncover what 300 years of secrecy had kept buried. 3 days into their new life at the cabin, Danny made the discovery that would change everything. Eli was outside splitting firewood, a skill he was learning through trial and error, when he heard his son's voice calling from inside, high with excitement. "Dad, Dad, you have to see this." Eli set down the axe and wiped sweat from his forehead. The physical work felt good after months of factory routine, even if his hands were already developing blisters. "What is it, buddy?" "I've found something in the ceiling." Inside, Danny stood on a chair beneath an access panel in the study's ceiling that Eli hadn't noticed before. The boy's face was streaked with dust, but his eyes shone with the thrill of discovery. "I was looking at the books about Japan, and I heard something moving up there. I thought it might be squirrels, but look what I found instead." Danny held out a piece of paper that looked ancient, not just old, but genuinely aged, the kind of yellowed parchment that belonged in a museum. But this wasn't parchment. It was rice paper, thin as tissue and covered with symbols that definitely weren't English. "Where exactly did you find this?" Eli asked, taking the fragment carefully. "There's a whole box up there, wrapped in some kind of cloth. This fell out when I moved it." Eli studied the paper in the lamplight. Most of the symbols were incomprehensible, but scattered among them were recognizable landmarks, what looked like a tree with distinctive bent branches, a rock formation that might have been the granite outcropping they'd passed on the drive-in, and something that could have been the cabin itself, though drawn from a different angle. "Danny, this looks like a map." "That's what I thought too. But a map to what?" Eli held the fragment up to the window, letting daylight reveal details the lamp had hidden. There were more marking small X's scattered across what appeared to be the area around the cabin, and something that looked like writing in the corner, though whether it was Japanese or just very faded English, he couldn't tell. "Let's see what else is in that box." Getting the container down required moving the chair and stretching to reach into the narrow space between ceiling joists. The box itself was wrapped in silk that had once been white but had faded to the color of old ivory. Inside, nested like secrets waiting to be told, were more fragments of the same rice paper, each one covered with symbols and crude drawings. Danny spread them carefully on the study table, his young hands more delicate with the ancient paper than Eli's work-roughened fingers. "Look, Dad, they fit together." He was right. The fragments, when arranged properly, formed a rough map of the area surrounding the cabin. But this wasn't a modern survey map. It was hand-drawn with the kind of careful detail that spoke of someone who had walked every inch of the terrain, noting landmarks that mattered to a particular purpose. "What do you think it's for?" Danny asked. Eli traced one of the paths marked on the map with his finger. It led from the cabin to the bent tree they'd both noticed on their first dia, massive pine that had been struck by lightning years ago and grown back in a distinctive curved shape. From there, the path continued to what looked like a series of rocks, then to something marked with a symbol that resembled a cross, though it might have been something else entirely. "I have no idea, but look at this." He pointed to writing in the corner of the largest fragment where someone had written in English, "For the one who comes after, H.M. Itenjubai Bashasi." "Great. Grandpa's initials," Danny breathed. "He left this for us. Maybe. Or maybe for whoever inherited the cabin." But even as he said it, Eli felt the stirring of something deeper. The photograph of his grandfather in Tokyo, the books about Japanese culture, and now this map, with its Asian characters and careful notation all pointed to a story he didn't understand, but was beginning to think he needed to. "Can we follow it?" Danny asked. "Just to see where it goes?" Eli's practical side, the part that had been honed by 3 years of single parenthood and financial struggle, said no. They had enough to worry about without chasing after what was probably just an old man's hobby. But looking at his son's eager face, seeing the first real spark of enthusiasm Danny had shown since they'd arrived, he found himself reconsidering. "Just for fun," Danny pressed, "like an adventure." And maybe that was what they both needed, an adventure, something to remind them that life could hold mystery and excitement instead of just bills and disappointment. "All right," Eli said, "but we stick to the marked paths and we turn back if anything seems dangerous." They started early the next morning, following the map's first landmark to the lightning-struck pine. The tree was even more impressive up close, its trunk twisted into an almost spiral shape that spoke of decades of wind and weather. Someone had carved a small symbol into the bark, the same symbol that appeared on the map. "This way," Danny said, consulting the paper fragments like a professional navigator. The path led deeper into the woods than Eli had expected, following terrain that seemed deliberately chosen to remain hidden from casual hikers. They walked for nearly an hour before reaching the rock formation marked on the map, a cluster of boulders that formed a natural shelter with another carved symbol barely visible on the largest stone. "Dad, look at this." Danny had wandered to the far side of the rocks, where the ground dipped into a natural depression. "There's something weird about the dirt here." Eli joined him and immediately saw what his son meant. While the surrounding forest floor was covered with decades of fallen leaves and natural debris, this area was strangely clear. The earth was dark and rich, as if it had been disturbed and then carefully tended. "Someone's been digging here," Eli said. "Recently?" "No, but not that long ago either, maybe a few years." Danny consulted the map again. "This is where the X is, right here." They looked at each other, father and son, and Eli saw his own mixture of excitement and apprehension reflected in Danny's young face. "We don't have tools," Eli said. "There's an old shovel in the cabin shed. This could be nothing, just a wild goose chase. Or it could be something amazing." In the end, it was Danny's unwavering optimism that decided it. They hiked back to the cabin, retrieved a rusty shovel and a small garden trowel, and returned to the site just as the afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees. Eli started digging in the center of the cleared area, where the earth looked most recently disturbed. The soil came up easily, as if it had been dug before, and knew the rhythm. After about 3 feet, the shovel struck something that wasn't dirt or rock. "What is it?" Danny asked, kneeling beside the hole. Eli used the trowel to carefully clear dirt away from whatever lay beneath. What emerged was wood-old, dark wood that had been carefully sealed with some kind of preservative. As he cleared more dirt, the outline of a box became visible. It took both of them to lift it out of the ground. The container was heavier than Eli had expected, and when they set it on level ground beside the hole, he could see why. The wood was thick and expertly joined, built to last centuries rather than years. "Should we open it here?" Danny asked. Eli looked around at the darkening forest, suddenly aware of how alone they were and how far they'd come from the cabin. "Let's take it back. We can open it properly there." The hike back seemed longer with the weight of the box between them, but Danny never complained. His excitement was infectious, and by the time they reached the cabin, even Eli felt like a treasure hunter instead of an unemployed factory worker. They set the box on the kitchen table and examined it by lamplight. There was no lock, just a simple latch that opened with gentle pressure. Inside, wrapped in more silk cloth, was something that made them both catch their breath. It was armor, but not like anything Eli had ever seen in a museum or movie. This was samurai armor, complete and perfectly preserved, from the distinctive helmet with its face mask to the intricate chest plates bound with silk cords. Every piece gleamed as if it had been polished yesterday, showing no signs of the centuries it must have spent buried in the Maine woods. "Is it real?" Danny whispered. Eli lifted the helmet carefully. It was heavier than he'd expected, and the metalwork was incredibly detailed. This wasn't a replica or a costume. This was the genuine article, crafted by someone who understood both the art and the necessity of protection in battle. "I think it is," he said. "But what's samurai armor doing buried in the woods of Maine?" Danny was examining the chest piece, running his small fingers along the silk cords that bound the metal plates together. Maybe Great-Grandpa brought it back from Japan? Maybe. But even as Eli said it, he knew that didn't explain everything. This armor hadn't been bought from a shop or taken as a war souvenir. It had been buried with ceremony, with care, as if someone had wanted to ensure it would survive whatever came next. As they carefully lifted each piece from the box, examining the craftsmanship and marveling at the preservation, Eli felt the weight of something larger than their small discovery. This wasn't just about an old map or even valuable artifacts. This was about a story that connected his family to something ancient and honorable, something that had traveled across an ocean and waited centuries to be found. But he couldn't have imagined, as they sat in the lamplight surrounded by pieces of history, that the armor was just the beginning. The real treasure and the real danger lay much deeper, waiting for a father and son who were finally ready to claim their inheritance. The next morning brought visitors, the first since they'd arrived at the cabin. Eli woke to the sound of vehicles climbing the dirt road, an unusual rumble in the forest, quiet, that sent him to the window with a cup of coffee and a frown. 2 trucks had pulled into the clearing. One belonged to Tom Walsh, the hardware store owner who'd been grudgingly helpful when they'd stopped for supplies, and the other carried a man Eli didn't recognize, elderly, with carefully combed white hair and the kind of clothes that suggested he wasn't local. "Dad, who are those people?" Danny asked, peering around his father's shoulder. "I don't know, but we'd better go find out." They'd hidden the armor in the bedroom closet the night before, wrapped carefully in bedsheets and tucked behind winter coats that smelled of mothballs and old memories. Now Eli was grateful for that caution as he opened the front door and stepped onto the sagging porch. "Morning, Eli," Tom called out, approaching with the slightly apologetic manner of someone bringing unwelcome news. "Hope you don't mind the early visit. This here's Dr. Martin Kessel from the university down in Portland. He heard you'd inherited Harold's place." Dr. Kessel stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. "Mr. Mercer, I was a friend of your grandfather's. We corresponded for many years about his research into local history." "Research?" Eli kept his voice neutral, though his mind was racing. "I wasn't aware he was involved in any research." "Oh yes, quite extensively. Harold was fascinated by stories of early Asian immigrants to Maine particularly, some rather far-fetched tales about Japanese visitors in the 1700s. Nonsense, of course, but he was quite passionate about it." Danny had slipped out beside Eli, listening with the focused attention he brought to any adult conversation that might contain something interesting. "Did he ever find anything to support these stories?" Eli asked. Dr. Kessel chuckled in the way academics do when discussing other people's foolishness. "Nothing credible. Harold claimed to have found various artifacts over the years, but he was never willing to share them for proper authentication. Between you and me, I suspect he was a bit of a romantic, the kind of man who sees mysteries where others see coincidence." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "Doc, maybe we should just tell him what we came to say." "Of course." Dr. Kessel's expression became more businesslike. "Mr. Mercer, I understand you're in somewhat difficult financial circumstances. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer for any historical materials your grandfather might have left behind. Papers, artifacts, anything that might support his theories." "How generous?" Eli asked, though he'd already decided not to trust this man. "Quite generous, enough to make your situation considerably more comfortable." The vagueness of the offer, combined with the professor's dismissive attitude toward his grandfather's work, set off warning bells in Eli's mind. If Harold's research was so worthless, why was Dr. Kessel willing to pay for it? "I'll need some time to go through everything," Eli said carefully. "Harold left quite a bit behind." Of course, but don't wait too long. University funding has its deadlines, you understand." Dr. Kessel handed him a business card. "Call me within the week." After the visitors left, Eli found himself pacing the cabin, while Danny returned to his exploration of their grandfather's books. Something about the encounter didn't sit right, but he couldn't identify exactly what bothered him. "Dad," Danny called from the study, "you should see this." Danny had pulled out one of the Japanese history books and was pointing to a chapter heading, "Look, it's about samurai who left Japan in the 1600s and 1700s. Great-grandpa marked a bunch of stuff. Eli sat beside his son and examined the book. Harold had indeed marked passages using a neat, precise handwriting that filled the margins with observations and questions. One note in particular caught Eli's attention. Takeshi Yamamoto exiled 1720. One ship records Portland Harbor 1722. Danny, help me check something. They returned to the bedroom and carefully unwrapped the armor again. In daylight streaming through the window, Eli could see details he'd missed the night before. The helmet bore a small family crest worked into the metal, and the chest piece had delicate inlay work that spoke of master craftsmanship. But it was when they lifted the bottom section of the armor that they made their second discovery. Wrapped in silk and nestled beneath the leg guards was a sword knot, just any sword, but a katana of obvious quality and age. The blade, when Eli carefully drew it from its scabbard, gleamed with the distinctive pattern of folded steel that marked genuine Japanese swordsmithing. But more importantly, there were characters etched near the base of the blade. "Can you read any of that?" Danny asked. "No, but I know someone who might be able to." Eli was thinking of Mrs. Chen, who ran the small Chinese restaurant in the nearest town and had mentioned once that she could read some Japanese characters. But before they could plan their next move, Danny made another discovery. "Dad, there's something else in here." He was holding a piece of paper that had been wrapped around the sword's handler, not rice paper this time, but regular writing paper that looked much more recent. The handwriting was the same neat script they'd seen in the book margins. "If you're reading this," the note began, "then you are the one I've been waiting for." The armor and sword belonged to Takeshi Yamamoto, a samurai who came to these shores in 1722, carrying with him a burden that has waited 3 centuries to be lifted. I have spent my life trying to understand his story, and I believe you are meant to finish what he started. The map will lead you to the rest. Trust no one who speaks of profit before honor. The way of the warrior demands nothing less than complete commitment to the path. Harold Mercer, your grandfather, who never got to meet you." Eli read the note twice, feeling the weight of expectation in every carefully chosen word. His grandfather had known this day would come, had prepared for it, even though he'd never met the grandson who would inherit his secret. "Dad, what does it mean?" Danny asked. "I think it means we have a lot more to learn about Takeshi Yamamoto." They spent the rest of the day researching, using Harold's books and notes to piece together what they could of the story. Takeshi Yamamoto had been a samurai in service to a minor lord during Japan's isolationist period. For reasons that weren't entirely clear, he'd been exiled, not executed, which suggested his crime hadn't been treasonous, but serious enough to require permanent banishment. Ship records from Portland Harbor, which Harold had photocopied and filed carefully, showed a Japanese passenger arriving in 1722 on a merchant vessel. The name was listed as T. Yamamoto, and there was a notation that he'd paid his passage with items of considerable value. "So he brought treasure with him," Danny said, reading over his father's shoulder. "That's what it looks like. But what kind of treasure? And why did he bury it in the middle of the Maine woods?" The answer, Eli suspected, lay somewhere else on that ancient map. The armor and sword were impressive, but they felt like markers rather than destination signs left by someone who wanted to be found by the right person at the right time. As evening approached and they prepared another simple dinner, Eli found himself looking at his son with new eyes. Danny's excitement about the discovery wasn't just boyish enthusiasm for treasure hunting. There was something deeper there, a sense of rightness about the whole situation that Eli couldn't explain, but was beginning to trust. "Tomorrow," he said as they settled down for the night, "we follow the map again, see what else Takeshi Yamamoto left for us to find." "You think he knew we'd come here someday?" Eli looked around the cabinet, the books that had prepared them for this discovery, at the careful notes that had guided their understanding, at the map that had led them to their first treasure. "I think he was counting on it." The second expedition began before dawn, with Eli and Danny moving through the forest like conspirators, carrying backpacks loaded with water, snacks, and the carefully wrapped map fragments. They'd learned from their first adventure, bringing proper tools and telling themselves this was just exploration, though both knew they were lying. The map's next destination lay deeper in the woods, past the lightning-struck pine and the rock formation where they'd found the armor. This time, the path led to what appeared to be a natural spring, marked on the ancient rice paper with symbols that suggested water and purification. There, Danny pointed to a cluster of stones arranged in a perfect circle around a small pool of clear water, just like on the map. But this site was different from the armor's burial place. Instead of disturbed earth, they found a careful arrangement of rocks that looked natural but felt deliberate. Water bubbled up from some underground source, creating a pool about 6 feet across that reflected the morning sky like a mirror. "It's beautiful," Danny said, kneeling beside the water's edge. Eli consulted the map fragments. According to the markings, they should be looking for another symbol carved into stone, but these rocks were smooth river stones, worn by centuries of water and weather. "Maybe we're in the wrong place," he said. "No, look." Danny was pointing to the bottom of the pool, where something glinted beneath the clear water. "There's something down there." Eli peered into the spring and saw what his son had spotted, a flash of white and blue, too regular to be natural stone. Without hesitation, Danny rolled up his sleeves and reached into the water. "Careful," Eli warned, but the pool was shallow enough that Danny could easily reach the bottom. What his son brought up made them both gasp. It was a piece of porcelain, not just any porcelain, but a teacup of extraordinary delicacy and beauty. The white ceramic was decorated with intricate blue patterns that seemed to flow like water across the surface, and despite having spent decades or centuries submerged, it was perfect. "There's more," Danny said, reaching into the pool again. One by one, he retrieved the pieces of what became a complete tea set: 4 cups, a teapot, small plates, and a serving tray, all decorated with the same flowing blue patterns. Each piece was a work of art, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of masters who understood that beauty and function were inseparable. "Why would someone put a tea set at the bottom of a spring?" Danny asked, carefully arranging the pieces on a flat rock beside the pool. Eli lifted the teapot, marveling at its weight and the way light seemed to glow through the translucent ceramic. In Japanese culture, tea ceremony is sacred. It's about finding peace and showing respect. But why here? That was the question, wasn't it? As they sat beside the spring, surrounded by pieces of a tea set that belonged in a museum, Eli tried to imagine what would drive someone to place such valuable objects in a remote forest pool. The answer came when Danny discovered the small scroll case, also submerged, also perfectly preserved by some miracle of craftsmanship and chance. Inside was another piece of rice paper, but this one bore a message in English, written in a different hand than Harold's notes. "For those who follow the path of honor," Eli read aloud, "know that peace must be earned through understanding. The way of tea teaches patience, respect, and the beauty of simple things. These gifts were meant for a life I could not live, but perhaps they will serve those who come after. Drink tea where the earth gives water freely, and remember that some treasures are meant to be shared." Below the message was a signature: Takeshi Yamamoto, 1742. "He wrote this 20 years after he arrived," Eli said, doing the math. "He'd been living in the woods for 2 decades. Living here, in the middle of nowhere? Maybe not here exactly, but somewhere nearby. Close enough to know about this spring, close enough to come here regularly." They packed the tea set carefully, wrapping each piece in the cloth they'd brought for just such a discovery. But as they prepared to leave, Danny noticed something else. "Dad, look at the stones around the pool, they're not random." He was right. Now that Eli looked more carefully, he could see that the stones had been arranged with purpose. They formed a pattern not obvious, but deliberate, that seemed to point in a specific direction. "The path continues," Eli realized, consulting the map. This wasn't a destination, it was another waypoint. But as they gathered their things and prepared to follow the stone markers deeper into the forest, they heard something that made them both freeze: voices coming from the direction they'd traveled. "Sure they went this way? Tom saw them heading into the woods early this morning. They're following something, I'm sure of it." Eli recognized Dr. Kessel's voice, though it sounded different away from the cabinless academic, more urgent. He grabbed Danny's arm and motioned toward a cluster of large boulders where they could hide and listen. "Told you Harold was onto something," a second voice said. "That old man spent 40 years researching this area. He wouldn't have wasted his time unless he'd found something real. The question is, how much do the boy and his father know?" "Dr. Kessel replied, "If they're just following random maps, we can probably buy them off. But if they've actually found artifacts, then we take them. Simple as that." The casual way the second man spoke about theft made Eli's blood run cold. These weren't academics interested in historical preservation. These were treasure hunters, willing to use whatever methods necessary to claim what they wanted. "Let's see where this trail leads," Dr. Kessel said. "If we're lucky, they'll do the hard work for us." The voices faded as the men continued deeper into the woods, following the same path Eli and Danny had planned to take. Father and son waited in their hiding place until they were sure the men were gone, then made their way quietly back toward the cabin. "Are they going to steal our treasure?" Danny asked as they hiked through the forest. "They're going to try," Eli said, "but we're not going to let them." Back at the cabin, they hid the tea set with the armor and sword, then sat at the kitchen table to plan their next move. The beautiful porcelain pieces seemed to glow in the afternoon light, and Eli found himself thinking about Takeshi Yamamoto's message about sharing treasures. "Danny, what do you think Great-Grandpa would want us to do?" Danny considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all moral dilemmas. "I think he'd want us to protect the treasures, but also to understand why they're important." "And Dr. Kessel? He only cares about money. That's not the same thing." Eli nodded, feeling proud of his son's insight. "So we need to stay ahead of them, learn what Takeshi was trying to tell us before they can interfere." That evening, they prepared tea using the ancient porcelain set, boiling water from the cabin's well, and using green tea they found in Harold's carefully organized pantry. The simple ceremony felt profound, surrounded as they were by books about Japanese culture and holding cups that had been crafted for this exact purpose centuries ago. "It tastes different from regular tea," Danny observed. "Maybe it's the cups, or maybe it's knowing the story behind them." As they sipped their tea and watched the sun set through the cabin's windows, Eli felt something shifting inside him. For the first time since losing his job, since inheriting this isolated property, since beginning this strange treasure hunt, he felt like they were moving towards something important rather than just running from their problems. The tea set represented more than valuable antiques. It represented a way of life that valued beauty, ceremony, and taking time to appreciate simple pleasures. In their rushed, worry-filled existence, Eli had forgotten that such things mattered. "Tomorrow we go back to the spring," he decided. "But this time we'll be more careful, and we'll be ready for Dr. Kessel and his friends." "How?" Eli smiled, feeling for the first time like he might be worthy of Takeshi Yamamoto's trust. "By remembering that this isn't about treasure hunting. It's about following a path that someone laid out for us 300 years ago. And paths like that don't lead to dead ends, they lead to exactly where you're supposed to be." The jade amulet found them, rather than the other way around. 3 days had passed since their encounter with Dr. Kessel and his companion in the woods. Eli had spent the time diving deeper into Harold's books and notes, trying to understand not just what Takeshi Yamamoto had hidden, but why. The samurai's story was emerging piece by piece, a warrior exiled for refusing to participate in his lord's corruption, carrying treasures meant to fund a new life in a new world. But it was Danny who made the discovery that changed everything. "Dad, this is weird," he called from the study, where he'd been examining the books while Eli prepared their morning coffee. Eli found his son holding one of Harold's journals, not the published books about Japanese history, but a personal notebook filled with decades of observations and theories. "Look at this entry from 1985, Danny said, pointing to a page marked with Harold's careful handwriting. The boy responds to the jade piece differently than expected. When I showed him the amulet, his eyes changed color, briefly darker, as if something was looking out from inside. This confirms my theory about genetic memory and the bloodline connection. The guardian chooses its guardian. The boy? Eli asked, though he was beginning to suspect he knew the answer. He's writing about you, Dad. You would have been about my age in 1985. Eli stared at the journal entry, trying to remember a visit to his grandfather that had never happened, at least, not in his conscious memory. But as he read Harold's notes, fragments began to surface. A dim recollection of an old man with kind eyes, a long car ride through forests, something green and warm in his palm that had made him feel safe. I remember, he said slowly. My mother brought me here once, when I was very young. I thought it was a dream. Danny flipped through more pages, finding entries that tracked a young Eli's brief visit and his reaction to various artifacts Harold had collected over the years. But it was the entry about the jade amulet that made them both understand the significance of what was happening. The amulet glowed when the boy held it, Danny read. Faint but unmistakable. After 30 years of research, I finally understand. This isn't about finding treasure. It's about bloodline guardianship passing from one generation to the next. Takeshi didn't just bury artifact, she established a legacy. The treasures will reveal themselves when the right person comes looking. Where is this amulet now? Eli asked. They searched the cabin systematically, checking every drawer, every shelf, every hiding place they could imagine. It was Danny who finally thought to look in the most obvious place, the small wooden box on Harold's bedside table that they'd assumed held nothing but old buttons and spare change. The jade amulet lay at the bottom of the box, wrapped in black silk. It was smaller than Eli had expected, about the size of a silver dollar, but carved with incredible detail. Dragons chased each other around the circumference, their eyes set with tiny gems that caught the light like stars. In the center was a symbol that matched one of the markings on their map. The moment Danny touched it, the amulet began to glow. Not dramatically, not like special effects in a movie, but with a soft inner light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the boy's heartbeat. Danny gasped and nearly dropped it, but instead of letting go, his grip tightened. It's warm, he said wonderingly, and it's humming. Eli could hear it too, sound so low, it was almost below the threshold of hearing, like the distant echo of temple bells. When Danny held the amulet up to the window, the light within it grew stronger, and the carved dragons seemed to move in the shifting glow. Dad, I can see things. What kind of things? Danny closed his eyes, holding the amulet against his chest. I can see the forest, but different. Older. There are buildings that aren't there anymore, and people wearing clothes like in the history books. Eli watched his son's face, seeing an expression he'd never witnessed before, a kind of deep concentration that seemed far too mature for a 12-year-old boy. There's a man, Danny continued, his voice distant. He's wearing armor like the one we found, but he's not fighting. He's building something. A house, I think, but not like houses now, more like the cabin, but bigger. Is it Takeshi? I think so. He looks sad, but determined, like he's doing something really important, even though it's hard. The vision lasted only a few minutes, but when Danny opened his eyes, they were different, older somehow, as if he'd experienced more than just images. He lived here, Danny said with absolute certainty, not in this exact spot, but close. He built a house and lived in the woods for 40 years, waiting for someone to find what he'd hidden. Waiting for us. Waiting for family. The amulet, it's like a key. It shows you things when you're supposed to see them. That afternoon brought more visitors, but this time Eli was prepared. He'd seen the dust cloud of approaching vehicles long before they reached the cabin, and by the time Dr. Kessel knocked on the door, the artifacts were hidden, and Danny was reading innocently in the study. But Dr. Kessel wasn't alone this time. He'd brought 2 companionsmen who didn't have the soft appearance of academics. They carried themselves like people accustomed to getting what they wanted through intimidation rather than negotiation. Mr. Mercer, Dr. Kessel said, his previous courtesy replaced by barely concealed impatience. I trust you've had time to consider my offer. I'm still going through Harold's things, Eli replied, keeping his voice steady. "There's quite a bit to sort through. Perhaps we could help expedite the process. My colleagues here are experts at identifying valuable historical materials." One of the colleagues smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "We're very thorough. I appreciate the offer, but I prefer to handle family matters myself." Dr. Kessel's expression hardened. "Mr. Mercer, I don't think you understand the situation. There are significant historical artifacts connected to this property, artifacts that belong in proper institutions, not mouldering away in some backwoods cabin." "What artifacts?" Eli asked, innocently. "Don't play games with us," the second colleague said, stepping closer. "We know Harold found something important. We know you're following his research, and we know you've been digging in the woods." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Eli felt Danny move to stand beside him, and he noticed his son's hand slip into his pocket where he'd been carrying the jade amulet. "Gentlemen," Eli said carefully, "you're welcome to search the property if you have a warrant. Otherwise, I'll have to ask you to leave." The threat was implicit but clear. Dr. Kessel's colleagues weren't the type to be deterred by legal niceties, and everyone in the room knew it. But before the situation could escalate, something extraordinary happened. Danny stepped forward, still holding the amulet in his pocket, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The afternoon light streaming through the windows dimmed, as if clouds had passed over the sun, though the sky had been clear moments before. "You should go," Danny said, and his voice carried an authority that seemed impossible from a 12-year-old boy. "This place doesn't want you here." Dr. Kessel's colleagues exchanged glances, and Eli saw something in their expressions he hadn't expected. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. "Kid's got quite an imagination," one of them said, but his voice lacked conviction. The amulet's glow was invisible through Danny's pocket, but Eli could feel its presence, a warmth that seemed to push back against the cold menace of their visitors. And he could see that the men felt it too, though they couldn't name what was making them increasingly uncomfortable. "We'll be back," Dr. Kessel said, backing toward the door. "This isn't over." After they left, Eli and Danny stood in the cabin's main room, listening to the sound of vehicles departing and feeling the atmosphere slowly return to normal. "That was the amulet, wasn't it?" Eli asked. Danny nodded, pulling the jade piece from his pocket. It was still glowing, but fainter now, as if it had expended energy defending them. "It doesn't like bad people," Danny said simply. "It can tell when someone wants to hurt what it's protecting." "And what is it protecting?" "Us. The treasures, the story." Danny looked up at his father with eyes that seemed far too knowing. "Dad, I don't think we found the amulet by accident. I think it was waiting for us, just like everything else." That evening, they sat by the fireplace with Harold's journals spread around them, trying to piece together the full scope of what they'd inherited. The jade amulet sat on the table between them, no longer glowing but somehow still present, like a sleeping guardian keeping watch. "Look at this," Eli said, pointing to an entry from Harold's final years. "The bloodline carries more than genetics, it carries memory, purpose, responsibility. Eli will understand when the time comes, just as his son will understand after him. The way of the warrior isn't about fighting, it's about protecting what matters most." He knew we'd both be here, Danny realized. He knew I'd be the one to find the map, and that you'd be the one to understand what it meant. But understand what exactly? We found armor, a sword, a tea set, and an amulet that seems to have its own agenda. What's the bigger picture? Danny held up the amulet, studying its intricate carvings in the firelight. Maybe the bigger picture isn't about what we find. Maybe it's about what we become by finding it. Eli looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw changes that had happened, so gradually he'd almost missed them. Danny stood straighter now, spoke with more confidence, carried himself with a kind of quiet dignity that reminded Eli of the old photographs of Harold. The treasure hunt was transforming his son from a boy into something else, not a man yet, but someone who understood that some responsibilities couldn't be avoided or delegated. "Tomorrow we follow the map again," Eli decided. "But this time we finish what we started. we find whatever Takeshi Yamamoto was really trying to tell us. And if Dr. Kessel and his friends try to stop us. Eli looked at the jade amulet, remembering the way it had filled the room with protective energy, and smiled. Then they'll learn that some guardians have been waiting 300 years to do their job. The scroll of lineage found them in the most unexpected place, the town library. Eli had driven into Millbrook that morning to research property records and hopefully find more information about Harold's 40 years of investigation. Danny had come along, still carrying the jade amulet in his backpack. They'd both learned it wasn't wise to leave it unattended at the cabin. The Millbrook Public Library was a small, underfunded building that looked like it hadn't seen renovation since the 1960s, but the librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had been there for 30 years and remembered Harold Mercer well. "Oh my, yes," she said when Eli introduced himself. "Your grandfather was one of our most dedicated researchers. Came in every week for decades, always asking about the same thing, early Asian settlement in Maine. Most people thought he was a bit eccentric, but I found his theories fascinating." "What kind of theories?" Danny asked. "He believed there were Japanese immigrants in this area much earlier than anyone realized. Not just in the 1800s, but back in the colonial period. He had maps, ship records, all kinds of documentation." Eli felt his pulse quicken. "Did he leave any of this research with the library?" "As a matter of fact, he did. Just last year, he brought in a box of materials he wanted preserved. Said he was getting old and wanted to make sure his work didn't disappear with him." Mrs. Patterson led them to a back room where boxes of donated materials waited for cataloging. "He was very specific about who should have access to it, though." "What do you mean?" "He said it was only for family members. Direct descendants. I thought it was odd at the time, but Harold was always particular about his research." The box she retrieved was larger than Eli had expected, filled with photocopied documents, hand-drawn maps, and what appeared to be decades of correspondence. But it was the scroll tube at the bottom, wrapped in silk and sealed with wax, that made Danny gasp. "That's the same silk as the other wrappings," he whispered. Mrs. Patterson looked curious but didn't ask questions as they signed the materials out and carried the box to their truck. But once they were parked outside the library, Danny was already breaking the wax seal on the scroll tube. Inside was a document unlike anything they'd seen before, not rice paper this time, but parchment that had been prepared with incredible care. The writing was in multiple languages: Japanese characters, English, and what might have been Portuguese or Spanish. "It's a family tree," Eli realized, spreading the scroll carefully across the truck's dashboard. But this wasn't just any genealogical document. It traced a bloodline that began with Takeshi Yamamoto in Japan and followed his descendants through 3 centuries of American history. Names, dates, locations, all meticulously recorded by someone who understood the importance of maintaining accurate records. "Dad, look." Danny was pointing to the bottom of the scroll, where the most recent entries had been written in Harold's familiar handwriting. "There's you, and there's me." Eli stared at his own name, written in his grandfather's careful script, followed by Danny's name and birth date. But it was the notation beside Danny's entry that made his breath catch. "Chosen Guardian 7th generation." The line continues. 7th generation of what? The answer was written in the margins, in a mixture of Harold's notes and what appeared to be much older text. "Guardians of the sacred trust, inheritors of duty, protectors of the way." They drove back to the cabin in thoughtful silence, the scroll and its implications weighing heavily on both of them. But as they pulled into the clearing, they realized they weren't alone. A sleek black SUV was parked beside the cabin, and 2 men in expensive suits were examining the property with professional interest. "Not Dr. Kessel's people," Eli observed. "No, but not friendly either." They approached cautiously, and one of the men, tall, Asian, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, stepped forward. "Mr. Mercer, my name is James Nakamura. I represent certain interests in Tokyo. We need to talk." Unlike Dr. Kessel's barely concealed greed, Nakamura projected a different kind of intensity, focused, respectful, but absolutely determined. "What kind of interests?" Eli asked. "The kind that have been waiting 300 years for this conversation." Inside the cabin, Nakamura explained himself with the directness of someone who rarely had to waste time on preliminary courtesies. "My family has been searching for Takeshi Yamamoto's legacy since he disappeared from Japan in 1721. We represent the descendants of his original lord, the man he served before his exile." "The man who corrupted himself," Danny said quietly, and Nakamura's eyes sharpened with interest. "You know the story?" "Some of it. We know he was exiled for refusing to participate in corruption." Nakamura nodded approvingly. "Takeshi was asked to falsify records that would have allowed his lord to steal land from peasant farmers. When he refused, he was branded a traitor and sentenced to death. But he escaped, taking with him certain items that didn't belong to him." "What kind of items?" Eli asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Sacred artifacts, religious treasures, and a considerable amount of gold that was meant to compensate the farmers his lord was trying to cheat." Nakamura's expression was grave. "My family has spent centuries trying to locate these items so they could be returned to their rightful owners." Eli felt the weight of the scroll in his backpack and the warmth of Danny's amulet nearby. "And you think we have them?" "I think you're the key to finding them. Takeshi Yamamoto wasn't just a thief, Mr. Mercer. He was a man of honor who took responsibility for his lord's crimes and tried to make things right in the only way he could. By crossing an ocean and hiding everything in the Maine woods, by establishing a trusted guardianship that would last until someone worthy could be found to complete his mission." Nakamura reached into his briefcase and withdrew a document that looked remarkably similar to their scroll of lineage. "This is our family's record of the search. Every generation has continued looking, following leads, hiring investigators, searching for any trace of what happened to Takeshi and his cargo." Danny moved closer to examine the document, and as he did, the jade amulet in his backpack began to glow faintly, but enough to be visible through the fabric. Nakamura noticed immediately. "You have one of the artifacts." "We have several," Eli admitted, making a decision that felt both risky and necessary. "But we're still trying to understand what we're supposed to do with them." "May I see?" The next hour changed everything. When Nakamura examined the armor, sword, tea set, and amulet, his professional composure cracked, revealing emotion that spoke of a lifetime devoted to this search. "These are authentic," he breathed, holding the katana with the reverence of someone who understood its true value. "This sword belonged to Takeshi's family for 8 generations, and this armoret was crafted by master smiths who worked exclusively for the imperial court." "But why did he bring them to America?" Danny asked. "Because he needed to fund his new life, and because he understood that these treasures would be safer here than in Japan, where his lord's corruption was spreading like a disease through the political system." Nakamura set down the sword and looked directly at Eli. "Mr. Mercer, I'm not here to take these artifacts from you. I'm here to offer you something much more valuable, the truth about why your family has been chosen to guard them." He opened his briefcase again and withdrew a thick folder. Takeshi didn't just hide treasure and disappear. He spent 40 years in these woods, building a legacy that was meant to right the wrongs his lord had committed. Every artifact you found is a piece of that legacy. "What kind of legacy?" "The kind that turns stolen gold into schools for poor children. The kind that transforms sacred artifacts into symbols of honor restored. The kind that takes a warrior's shame and turns it into a family's purpose." Eli felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a picture he could almost see. "You're saying Takeshi built some kind of foundation?" "I'm saying he built a trust that has been waiting 3 centuries for the right guardians to activate it. And according to both our records," Nakamura gestured to the scrolls spread across the table, "you and your son are those guardians." Danny had been listening with the focused attention he brought to all adult conversations that might change his life. Now he spoke up with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "What happens if we say no?" Nakamura smiled for the first time since they'd met him. Then you say no, and my family continues searching for another 300 years. But I don't think you will. Why not? Because you're already protecting the artifacts from people who would exploit them. Because your son carries Takeshi's amulet like it was meant for him. And because some responsibilities aren't given to us, they're revealed to us when we're ready to accept them. As afternoon faded to evening, Eli found himself looking at his son and seeing not just a 12-year-old boy, but the seventh generation of a family line that had been preserved for this exact moment. The weight of that realization should have been crushing, but instead it felt like coming home. The crystal compass revealed itself at the moment when everything Eli thought he understood about their situation proved to be wrong. It began with Nakamura's phone call that evening, his voice tight with urgency. "Mr. Mercer, you and your son need to leave the cabin immediately. Dr. Kessel isn't working alone, and he's not just interested in historical artifacts." "What do you mean?" "I mean, my family's 3-century search has attracted attention from people who don't care about honor or rightful ownership. They care about the fact that Takeshi Yamamoto was carrying approximately $200 million worth of gold and sacred artifacts when he disappeared." Eli felt the familiar chill of fear, but this time it was mixed with something else, anger. "You said you weren't here to take the artifacts." "I'm not, but there are others who are, and they've been watching Dr. Kessel's activities for months. They know he's close to finding something significant, and they're prepared to do whatever it takes to claim it." "How long do we have?" "Maybe an hour. Pack only essentials, and meet me at the coordinates I'm about to text you. There's something I need to show you before they arrive." The coordinates led to a hiking trail deeper in the woods than they'd ever explored, where Nakamura waited with equipment that looked more military than academic night vision goggles, communication devices, and what appeared to be a very sophisticated metal detector. "Mr. Nakamura," Eli said as they approached his position, "you're not really a researcher, are you?" "I'm a researcher the same way you're a factory worker," Nakamura replied with a slight smile. "We both have more complicated histories than we usually discuss." Danny shifted his backpack, feeling the weight of the artifacts they'd brought with them. "Are we safe here?" "For now, but we need to move quickly." Nakamura consulted what looked like a military-grade GPS device. "According to both our family records and your grandfather's research, there's one more site marked on Takeshi's map, the most important one. We've only found 3 of the marked locations," Eli said. "Because the 4th one is hidden differently, it requires all the other artifacts to reveal itself." They hiked for 20 minutes through terrain that seemed deliberately difficult to navigate, fallen logs, thick underbrush, and rocky ground that would discourage casual exploration. But Danny, carrying the jade amulet, began to walk with increasing confidence, as if he could sense their destination. "This way," he said, veering off the established trail toward a cluster of granite formations that looked like ancient monoliths. "How do you know?" Eli asked. "The amulet is getting warmer, and I can hear something like music, but very faint." Nakamura checked his equipment and nodded approvingly. "The boy is more sensitive to the artifact's resonance than most people would be. That's why bloodline inheritance matters. It's not just genetic, it's spiritual." They reached the granite formations just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows that made the stones look like fingers reaching toward the darkening sky. But it wasn't until Danny removed the jade amulet from his backpack that the true nature of the site revealed itself. The moment the amulet came into contact with the largest granite stone, the entire formation began to glow not with visible light, but with something that made the air itself seem charged with energy. And in the center of the stone circle, previously invisible, a depression appeared that was exactly the right size and shape to hold something round. "The compass," Nakamura breathed. He built a compass into the stone itself. Danny placed the amulet in the depression, and immediately the granite formations aligned themselves, not physically moving, but somehow shifting in relation to each other, like the pieces of a vast puzzle settling into their correct positions. What emerged from the center of the circle was unlike anything they'd seen before. It was a crystal roughly the size of a baseball that seemed to contain its own source of light. But this wasn't just decorative. As it rose from the stone, had it been hidden there all along, or did it appear from somewhere else entirely, lines of energy began to connect it to various points around the surrounding landscape. "It's showing us something," Danny said, his voice filled with wonder. The crystal was indeed displaying information, but not in any language or format they recognized. Instead, it projected a three-dimensional map of the area, complete with topographical details and markers that corresponded to locations they'd already explored. But there were more markers, dozens of them, scattered throughout the forest in a pattern that suggested careful planning and considerable resources. "My God," Nakamura whispered. "He didn't just bury a few artifacts, he created an entire network." Eli studied the projection, beginning to understand the scope of what they'd stumbled into. "How many sites are there?" "According to this, at least 20, maybe more." Nakamura was taking photographs of the crystal display with professional efficiency. "And they're all connected somehow. Look at these energy lines, linking them together." But it was Danny who asked the crucial question. Connected to do what? The answer came from the crystal itself, which began to project not just maps, but image scenes from the past that showed Takeshi Yamamoto not as a solitary exile, but as the leader of a community. There were other Japanese immigrants, families who had followed him to America, people who had helped him establish not just hiding places for treasure, but entire settlements. He wasn't alone, Eli realized. He brought people with him, or they followed him here. "More than that," Nakamura said, his voice filled with growing excitement. "He established a Colonia complete community with its own government, its own economy, its own culture. And he used the gold and artifacts he'd taken from Japan to fund it." The implications were staggering. They weren't just dealing with buried treasure, they were looking at evidence of a previously unknown chapter of American history. A Japanese settlement that had existed in the Maine wilderness for decades without any official record. But their amazement was interrupted by sounds that didn't belong in the forest: vehicle engines, radio chatter, and the systematic movement of people who knew how to operate in hostile territory. "They found us," Nakamura said grimly. "We need to move, now." "What about the crystal?" "Take it. It's what they're really after." But when Danny tried to lift the crystal compass from its position, something unexpected happened. Instead of coming free, it seemed to sink deeper into the stone, and the jade amulet began to pulse with urgent light. "It doesn't want to leave," Danny said. "Then we protect it here," Eli decided. "Whatever happens, we don't let them get their hands on it." Nakamura nodded approvingly. "Now you're thinking like a guardian." The sounds of their pursuers were getting closer, and in the growing darkness, Eli could see the beams of multiple flashlights sweeping through the trees. But he also noticed something else. The crystal compass wasn't just displaying information anymore. It was actively doing something, sending pulses of energy along those connecting lines to all the other sites in its network. "It's activating," Nakamura observed. "After 300 years of waiting, Takeshi's system is finally coming online." "What kind of system?" "The kind that transforms hidden treasure into active legacy, the kind that turns a warrior's exile into a family's mission." Nakamura checked his equipment one final time. "The kind that's about to make all of us very wealthy, very important, or very dead depending on how well we handle what comes next." As the first of their pursuers broke through the tree line, Eli looked at his son standing beside the glowing crystal compass, the jade amulet pulsing in his hands like a heartbeat, and realized that their treasure hunt had never been about finding artifacts. It had been about finding themselves and discovering that some inheritances come with responsibilities that can't be refused, only accepted with honor or abandoned with shame. The choice, he understood now, had been made 300 years ago by a samurai who refused to compromise his principles. Everything that followed, including this moment, was simply the consequence of that single act of integrity, playing out across generations until it reached two people who were finally ready to continue what he had started. The real treasure wasn't gold or artifacts, or even the crystal compass that could reveal the location of Takeshi's entire network. The real treasure was the chance to prove themselves worthy of the trust that had been placed in them by a man they'd never met, but whose honor had shaped their bloodline for 7 generations. Now all they had to do was survive long enough to claim it. The warrior's journal found them in the moments before the final confrontation, when they needed Takeshi's wisdom most. Hidden in the granite formation beneath the crystal compass, revealed only when the amulet and crystal worked together, was a compartment that contained Takeshi Yamamoto's complete account of his 40 years in the American wilderness. But this wasn't just a diary, it was a tactical manual, a spiritual guide, and a detailed plan for exactly the situation they now faced. He knew this day would come, Danny said, carefully lifting the leather-bound journal from its stone hiding place while the sounds of their pursuers grew closer. Eli opened the journal to the first page and found text written in perfect English, in the same careful handwriting they'd seen on the other messages. To my inheritors, you are reading this because the network has been activated and threatened. What follows is everything you need to know to protect what we have built and to complete what I could not finish in my lifetime. How much time do we have? Nakamura asked, monitoring the approaching voices through his communication equipment. Maybe 10 minutes before they reach this position, Eli replied, speed, reading through pages of dense text that somehow felt familiar, as if he'd read these words before in dreams. The journal revealed the true scope of Takeshi's achievement. He hadn't just hidden treasure, he'd created a self-sustaining trust that had been generating income for 3 centuries, managed by a network of descendants and allies who had kept the secret while building schools, funding scholarships, and supporting communities throughout New England. Look at this, Danny said, pointing to a detailed map that showed the location of every site in the network. There are banks, investment accounts, property holding. She turned the stolen gold into a fortune that's been growing for 300 years. How much? Nakamura asked. Eli found the answer on a page marked for the 7th Guardian. Current estimated value as of the year 2020, 198,000. Distributed across multiple legitimate enterprises and held in trust for activation by bloodline inheritors. The number was staggering, but what impressed Eli more was the purpose behind it. Takeshi had spent decades not just accumulating wealth, but planning its distribution. Every dollar was earmarked for specific purposes: education for disadvantaged children, support for immigrants adapting to new countries, preservation of cultural heritage, and assistance for anyone who chose honor over profit. He was trying to balance the scales, Eli realized. His lord stole from poor farmers, so Takeshi spent 40 years building a system to give back to poor families. And now, it's your responsibility, Nakamura said. The network has recognized you as the rightful inheritors. The crystal compass is the master key that activates everything, but only when held by someone Takeshi's bloodline accepts as worthy. But the journal contained more than financial information. The second half was devoted to tactical planning, detailed strategies for defending the network against exactly the kind of threat they currently faced. Listen to this, Danny said, reading from a section titled, When the Wolves Come. Those who seek to steal what we have built will come with violence and false authority. They will claim legal right and moral justification, but they serve only greed. Do not meet them with matching violence. Meet them with prepared resistance and the strength that comes from fighting for something greater than yourself. The journal outlined specific defensive strategies, using the forest terrain and the network of sites to create advantages for defenders who understood the system. Each location was connected to the others, not just energetically, but practically, with hidden paths, supply caches, and communication methods that turned the entire area into a fortress that looked like wilderness. He turned the whole forest into a protective maze, Nakamura observed, studying Takeshi's tactical diagrams. Anyone who doesn't know the system will get lost, but defenders can move between sites without being detected. Like a giant game of hide-and-seek, Danny said, except the seekers don't know the rules. Eli was reading the journal's final entries, written in Takeshi's last years, when the old samurai had known his time was ending, and the guardianship would pass to future generations. I have lived 40 years in exile, and found it to be 40 years of purpose, Takeshi had written. My lord's corruption drove me from my homeland, but it led me to build something better than I could have imagined in Japan. The treasure I took was not stolen, it was liberated from those who would have used it for evil and transformed into something that serves good. To my inheritors, you will face the same choice I faced. You can use this inheritance for your own benefit, or you can use it to serve something greater. The crystal compass will recognize your decision and respond accordingly. Choose wisely, for the honor of 7 generations depends on what you do next. The sound of boots on stone announced that their time for reading was over. Dr. Kessel's voice carried through the darkness, closer now, and filled with the authority of someone who believed he held all the advantages. Mr. Mercer, we know you're here. We've surrounded the area. Bring out the artifacts and no one needs to get hurt. Eli looked at his son, who was still holding the jade amulet and standing beside the crystal compass that continued to pulse with gentle light. Danny, are you scared? Yes, his son replied honestly, but I'm also angry. These people want to steal something that doesn't belong to them, and they want to hurt us for protecting it. And what do you think we should do about that? Danny consulted the journal one more time, finding a passage that seemed written specifically for this moment. A guardian's duty is not to win it, is to protect. Victory comes not from defeating enemies, but from ensuring that what matters most survives, regardless of what happens to us. We protect the compass, Danny said firmly, whatever it takes. Nakamura nodded approvingly. Then we use Takeshi's tactics. They may have surrounded this position, but they don't understand the ground they're fighting on. Eli felt something shifting inside him, not just resolve, but a kind of clarity that came from finally understanding his purpose. For months, he'd felt like a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Now he realized he'd been preparing his entire life for this moment, when everything he'd learned about protection, responsibility, and doing what's right would be tested. How many of them are there? He asked Nakamura. At least 8, probably more. Professional security contractors, not just academics and treasure hunters. Armed? Definitely. And us? Nakamura smiled grimly. We have something they don't. We're fighting for something that belongs to us, on ground that was prepared by someone who spent 40 years thinking about this exact situation. Danny had been studying the tactical diagrams in Takeshi's journal. Dad, look at this. There are passages under the stones-like tunnels that connect to the other sites. If we can get to the entrance, we can move through the network without them seeing us. Where's the entrance? Right here. Danny pressed the jade amulet against a specific symbol carved into the granite, and a section of stone swung inward, revealing a passage that led down into darkness. Takeshi built escape routes, Eli realized. He built more than that, Nakamura said, examining the passage with his night vision equipment. He built a way to turn this entire confrontation into something they'll never expect. The voices outside were getting closer, and Eli could see flashlight beams beginning to sweep across the granite formations. They had perhaps 2 minutes before Dr. Kessel's people reached their position. Danny, take the amulet and get into that passage. Follow it to wherever it leads and stay hidden until this is over. What about you? I'm staying with the compass. Someone has to make sure they don't get their hands on it. Then I'm staying too. Eli started to argue, but something in his son's expression stopped him. Danny wasn't speaking as a child, asking to be included in adult business. He was speaking as the 7th guardian, accepting a responsibility that was as much his as it was Eli's. All right, Eli said, but we do this Takeshi's way with honor, with strategy, and with the understanding that protecting the legacy matters more than protecting ourselves. Together, Danny agreed. As the first of their pursuers stepped into the circle of granite formations, father and son stood beside the crystal compass that contained the key to a fortune built on principle, surrounded by the wisdom of a warrior who had faced the same choice 3 centuries ago and chosen honor over safety. The final confrontation was about to begin, and for the first time since losing his job and inheriting a rundown cabin, Eli felt like he knew exactly who he was supposed to be. The sacred mirror revealed the truth about their attackers at the moment when truth mattered most. As Dr. Kessel's security team surrounded the granite formations, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like searching fingers, Danny made a discovery that changed the nature of the confrontation entirely. Hidden in the passage beneath the stones, exactly where Takeshi's journal had indicated it would be, was a bronze mirror, unlike anything they'd encountered before. It was roughly the size of a dinner plate, polished to perfection despite its obvious age, and decorated with symbols that seemed to move in the reflected light. "Dad," Danny whispered, "this isn't just showing our reflection." Eli looked into the mirror and saw not just his own face, but something far more disturbing, the true intentions of the people surrounding their position. In the mirror's surface, Dr. Kessel appeared not as an academic researcher, but as someone consumed by greed, his face twisted with an obsession that went far beyond scholarly interest. The security contractors showed as predators, men who had done this kind of work before and enjoyed the violence it involved. But more importantly, the mirror revealed something else. These weren't just treasure hunters. They were working for someone else. Someone whose image appeared in the mirror's depths like a puppet master pulling strings. "Nakamura," Eli called softly, "you need to see this." When Nakamura looked into the sacred mirror, his professional composure cracked completely. "That's impossible," he breathed. "What?" "The man behind all this, he's supposed to be dead. My family's records show him dying in Tokyo 50 years ago." In the mirror, they could see the truth. Dr. Kessel was taking orders from someone who had been hunting Takeshi's legacy for decades, someone whose family had never stopped trying to reclaim what they considered stolen property. The original Lord's family, Danny realized. They followed Takeshi to America. "Not followed," Nakamura corrected grimly. "They've been here all along, building influence, gathering resources, waiting for someone to finally locate the network so they could take it back." "But they're not the rightful owners," Eli protested. "They don't care about rightful ownership. They care about reclaiming what they see as stolen family property, regardless of why it was taken or what it's been used for since." The mirror showed more. Dr. Kessel, receiving payment from a consortium of wealthy families who traced their lineage back to the corrupt officials Takeshi had opposed. For them, this wasn't about historical artifacts or academic research. It was about recovering assets that had been funding their enemies for 3 centuries. "Mr. Mercer," Dr. Kessel's voice echoed off the granite stones. "We know you're in there. Let's discuss this reasonably." But the sacred mirror revealed the lie beneath his reasonable tone. In its surface, they could see Kessel signaling his men to prepare for assault, could see the weapons being readied, could see the complete absence of any intention to negotiate. "They're going to attack regardless of what we say," Eli whispered. "In about 30 seconds, Nakamura confirmed, checking his equipment. "They're just waiting for everyone to get into position." Danny was still studying the mirror, his young face serious with concentration. "Dad, there's something else. The mirror isn't just showing us what they're planning, it's showing us how to stop them." In the bronze surface, tactical information was appearing, the exact positions of each attacker, their planned routes of approach, and most importantly, the locations of Takeshi's defensive measures that were still active after 3 centuries. "Pressure plates," Eli realized, reading the mirror's revelations. "He built the whole area like a trap that only activates when threatened." "More than that," Danny said excitedly. "Look, if we activate the sequence using the amulet and the compass together, the entire network comes online. Not just here, but all 20 sites." "What does that mean?" Nakamura was studying the mirror's tactical display with professional interest. "It means Takeshi didn't just build hiding places for treasure. He built a complete defensive system that turns this entire forest into a maze that only the Guardians can navigate safely." The sound of approaching footsteps was getting closer, and Eli could see the first shadows moving between the granite formations above them. "How do we activate it?" "Place the amulet against the compass while holding the mirror." Danny read from symbols that were appearing in the bronze surface. But Dad, whoever does it, has to stay here to maintain the connection. The system needs a guardian present to keep working. The implications were clear. Someone would have to remain at the most dangerous position while the defensive network activated around them. "I'll do it," Eli decided immediately. "We'll do it together," Danny corrected. "The mirror shows both of us. It takes two guardians sewn for the past and one for the future." Above them, Dr. Kessel's patience finally ran out. "Move in, take the position, and secure any artifacts you find." The attack began with military precision-coordinated movement, covering fire, professional tactics designed to overwhelm defensive positions. But what the attackers encountered wasn't a typical defensive position. The moment Danny placed the jade amulet against the crystal compass, while Eli held the sacred mirror, the entire granite formation came alive. Hidden mechanisms that had waited 3 centuries for activation began to operate, and the forest itself became an ally. Stone pathways that looked solid revealed themselves to be illusions, causing attackers to stumble into concealed pits. Trees that appeared normal began to shift position, blocking sightlines and creating confusion. Most importantly, a network of mirrors hidden throughout the forest began to reflect and amplify light, creating a maze of false images that made it impossible for the attackers to distinguish between real targets and reflections. "What the hell is happening?" Dr. Kessel's voice carried panic now instead of authority. Through the sacred mirror, Eli and Danny could see the effect of Takeshi's defensive system, trained security contractors wandering in circles, unable to find their targets or even each other, while the forest itself seemed to move around them like a living thing. "It's working," Danny breathed, watching their attackers become increasingly disoriented. "Takeshi's traps are actually working." But the system demanded its price. Maintaining the connection between the amulet, compass, and mirror required constant focus and physical contact. Both Eli and Danny had to remain in position, vulnerable to any attacker who might break through the defenses. "Dad," Danny said quietly, "even if this works, they're not going to give up. They'll just come back with more people, better equipment. Then we make sure they understand this isn't worth coming back for." Eli consulted the mirror one more time, seeking guidance from Takeshi's wisdom. What he saw there was both inspiring and terrifying, a complete plan for ending the threat permanently, but only if the Guardians were willing to risk everything on a single decisive action. "Danny, the mirror is showing me how to shut down their entire operation, but it means activating something that can't be undone." "What kind of something?" "The kind that makes this network visible to the world, but also makes it impossible for anyone to steal. Takeshi built in a final safeguard. If the legacy is ever truly threatened, it can be transferred immediately to legitimate institutions where it will be protected forever. But that means we lose control of it. It means we complete Takeshi's mission. The fortune gets distributed to the causes he intended, the artifacts go to museums where they'll be preserved, and people like Dr. Kessel never get the chance to profit from someone else's honor." Through the chaos above, they could hear Dr. Kessel shouting orders, trying to regroup his scattered team. But his authority was cracking as his men realized they were facing something beyond their understanding or ability to counter. "How long do we have to decide?" Danny asked. Eli looked into the sacred mirror one final time and saw the answer written in Takeshi's own hand. "The choice belongs to the Guardians, but the choice must be made before the enemy adapts to our defenses. Honor demands action, not endless deliberation." "We do it," Eli decided. "We finish what Takeshi started." "Together," Danny agreed, and placed his hand over his father's on the mirror's surface. The moment their combined intention focused on completing Takeshi's legacy rather than just protecting it, everything changed. The warrior's mask appeared at the moment when everything hung in the balance, when the choice between victory and honor would determine not just their fate, but the fate of Takeshi's 300-year legacy. The mask materialized from the crystal compass itself, rising from its depths like an ancient spirit finally called to service. It was carved from dark wood and decorated with silver inlay that seemed to flow like water in the reflected light of the sacred mirror. This wasn't just ceremonial, it was the face of a guardian, meant to be worn only when the final test arrived. "Dad," Danny whispered, "the compass is showing us something new." Through the chaos of Dr. Kessel's increasingly desperate attempts to penetrate Takeshi's defenses, the crystal compass was projecting new images, not tactical information this time, but memories. They could see Takeshi himself, 3 centuries ago, standing in this exact spot and facing a similar choice. In the vision, the young samurai held the same mask, preparing to make a decision that would affect generations of descendants he would never meet. But he wasn't alone. Around him stood the other Japanese immigrants who had followed him to America, families who had trusted his leadership and shared his exile. He wasn't just deciding for himself, Eli realized. He was deciding for an entire community. The vision showed what happened next. Takeshi putting on the mask and accepting the role of eternal guardian, binding his spirit to the network he'd created so that it would continue to serve its purpose long after his death. It was why the defensive system still functioned, why the artifacts had remained hidden until the right people found them, why everything they'd experienced felt guided by invisible hands. "He's still here," Danny breathed. Not as a ghost, but as part of the system itself. Above them, Dr. Kessel's voice had taken on a note of genuine fear. "Fall back. Regroup at the vehicles. Something's wrong with this place." But his men were past the point of organized retreat. Takeshi's defensive maze had scattered them throughout the forest, and every attempt to find their way back to a central position led them deeper into confusion. Some were calling out to teammates they couldn't locate. Others had simply stopped moving, too disoriented to trust their own senses. "The system is working," Nakamura observed, monitoring the situation through his equipment. "But it won't hold them forever. Eventually they'll adapt or bring in reinforcements." "Then it's time for the final choice," Eli said, reaching for the warrior's mask. But Danny caught his hand. "Wait. Look at what the mirror is showing us now." In the sacred mirror's surface, they could see not just the current situation, but its ultimate consequences. If they completed Takeshi's final safeguard, transferring the entire network to legitimate institutions, the immediate threat would end, but so would their role as guardians. The fortune would be distributed according to Takeshi's wishes, the artifacts would be preserved in museums, and the family legacy would become public history. "We'd go back to being ordinary people," Eli realized. "Is that what you want?" Danny asked. Before Eli could answer, the situation above took a dangerous turn. Dr. Kessel, realizing his team was scattered and his mission failing, made a desperate decision. Instead of retreating, he began moving toward the granite formations alone, carrying what looked like explosives. "He's going to try to destroy the site," Nakamura warned. "If he can't have the treasure, he'll make sure no one else can either." "Can he do that?" "Those charges are military grade. They could collapse this entire formation and bury everything permanently." Danny looked at the warrior's mask, then at his father. "Dad, if we're going to do this, it has to be now." Eli lifted the mask, feeling its weight not just physical, but spiritual. The moment he put it on, he would be accepting the same responsibility Takeshi had accepted 3 centuries ago, to protect something greater than himself, regardless of personal cost. "Together," he said, echoing the word that had guided them through this entire journey. Danny nodded and placed his hands on both the jade amulet and the crystal compass. Together. The moment Eli donned the warrior's mask, the entire network came online with power they hadn't imagined possible. Every site connected to every other site, creating a web of energy that encompassed not just the forest, but extended to locations throughout New England, where Takeshi's legacy had taken root over the centuries. Through the mask, Eli could see it all. Schools built with Takeshi's gold, scholarships funded by 3 centuries of careful investment, immigrant families supported through their most difficult transitions, cultural preservation projects that kept ancient traditions alive in a new world. The 198 million hadn't just been sitting in accounts, it had been actively working, generating more resources while serving its intended purpose. We're not the first guardians, he realized. There have been others, people who found pieces of the network over the years and chose to serve it rather than exploit it. And now it's our turn, Danny said. But their moment of understanding was interrupted by Dr. Kessel's appearance at the edge of the granite circle. He was disheveled, his academic composure completely gone, replaced by the desperate determination of someone who had invested everything in a plan that was falling apart. "Whatever you're doing, stop it," he shouted, holding up the explosive device. "This ends now, one way or another." Through the warrior's mask, Eli could see not just Dr. Kessel's physical presence, but his spiritual state, a man so consumed by greed and family resentment that he'd lost sight of everything else. There was no negotiating with someone in that condition, no reasoning that could penetrate such obsession. "Dr. Kessel," Eli called out, his voice somehow different with the mask deeper, carrying an authority that seemed to come from beyond himself. "You're fighting a battle that ended 3 centuries ago. Takeshi's lord lost then, and you're losing now. That treasure belongs to my family. It was stolen from us. It was liberated from corruption and transformed into something honorable. That's not theft, that's justice." But Dr. Kessel was beyond hearing rational arguments. He raised the explosive device, and Eli realized that the man was prepared to destroy everything rather than accept defeat. That was when Danny made the choice that completed their transformation from treasure hunters to true guardians. Without hesitation, the 12-year-old boy stepped forward, still holding the jade amulet, and spoke with a voice that carried 3 centuries of accumulated wisdom. "Dr. Kessel, you can destroy this site, but you can't destroy what it represents. Takeshi's legacy isn't buried in the ground, it's living in the world, helping people, making things better. Even if you kill us and blow up everything here, that will continue." The simple truth of it, spoken by a child who understood honor better than the adults around him, seemed to penetrate Dr. Kessel's obsession in a way that threats and arguments couldn't. "You don't understand," Dr. Kessel said, but his voice had lost its desperate edge. "My family has been searching for this for generations. We've spent fortunes, devoted our lives to finding what was taken from us." "And what have you built with all that searching?" Danny asked gently. "What have you created? What have you given to the world?" The question hung in the air like a judgment, and through the warrior's mask, Eli could see the exact moment when Dr. Kessel's certainty cracked. For the first time, the man was forced to confront the difference between seeking to reclaim something and seeking to create something. "We have to finish this," Eli said quietly to his son. Danny nodded and placed the jade amulet against the crystal compass one final time. "For Takeshi, for everyone he helped, for everyone we can still help." The warrior's mask responded to their unified intention, and the final safeguard activated. 6 months later, the memorial stone stood where the crystal compass had once been, marking not an ending but a transformation that had rippled outward to touch thousands of lives. The stone itself was simple Vermont granite carved with Takeshi Yamamoto's story in both English and Japanese, surrounded by a garden that Danny had helped design, using principles from the tea ceremony they'd discovered in the forest spring. But its simplicity belied the complexity of what it represented, the successful completion of a 300-year mission and the beginning of something new. "The dedication ceremony is next week," Eli said, reading from a letter that had arrived that morning from the Yamamoto Cultural Foundation, the official name of the institution that now managed Takeshi's legacy. "The Japanese Consul General will be here, along with representatives from all the schools and organizations that have been supported by the foundation over the years." Danny looked up from the book. He was reading's History of Japanese Immigration to America that featured a substantial chapter about the previously unknown settlement Takeshi had established. "Will Mr. Nakamura be there?" "He'll be here. He's been appointed as the Foundation's chief cultural liaison." Eli smiled, remembering how their former adversary had become one of their most valuable allies, once the truth about the network became public. He says he's looking forward to seeing how the museum project is progressing. The museum was Danny's way to display Takeshi's artifacts while keeping them connected to their original purpose. Built on the site where the cabin had once stood, it told the complete story of the samurai's exile and the community he'd created in the Maine wilderness. But more than that, it served as a center for the Foundation's ongoing work, connecting Takeshi's historical legacy with its modern mission. "Have you decided about the scholarship program?" Danny asked. Eli nodded, consulting another document from the stack of mail that seemed to grow larger every week. "We're funding full university scholarships for 50 students this year, all from families facing the kind of financial struggles we went through. The selection committee wants us to present the awards personally." The transformation of their lives had been as dramatic as anything in Takeshi's story. The network's activation had transferred the bulk of the fortune to the Foundation, but it had also established Eli and Danny as the permanent guardians of its mission. They were no longer poor, but more importantly, they were no longer lost. They had found their purpose in continuing what Takeshi had started, using resources to create opportunity for others. "Dad, do you ever miss it?" Danny asked. "The treasure hunting, I mean. The excitement of not knowing what we'd find next." Eli considered the question while looking around their new homey, a comfortable house near the museum, built with Foundation funds, but designed to accommodate the work they now did together. The walls were lined with maps and photographs documenting Foundation projects across New England, and Danny's desk was covered with correspondence from scholarship recipients and thank you letters from families who had been helped by programs they'd never heard of. "I miss the adventure," he admitted, "but I like what we found at the end of it. Even though we gave away the treasure, we didn't give it away. We completed it. There's a difference." They walked together to the window that looked out over the memorial garden, where visitors often came to sit quietly and reflect on the story they'd learned in the museum. Today, an elderly Japanese couple sat on one of the benches, reading from a guidebook and pointing at various plants that had been chosen for their significance in Japanese culture. "They're here because of what we did," Danny observed. "They're here because of what Takeshi did. We just made sure his story got told properly." But even as he said it, Eli knew that wasn't entirely true. Takeshi had built the foundation of their legacy, but every choice Eli and Danny had made, from following the first map to activating the final safeguard, had shaped what that legacy became. They weren't just custodians of someone else's vision, they were partners in an ongoing mission that continued to evolve. The doorbell interrupted their contemplation, and they found Mrs. Patterson from the library, standing on their porch with a package and a familiar expression of barely contained excitement. "More documents," she announced, holding up a box. "These came from a law firm in San Francisco. Apparently, word about Takeshi's story has reached other Japanese families on the West Coast, and they're finding their own connections to the network." Eli accepted the package with a mixture of anticipation and mild trepidation. Every month brought new discoveries, descendants of other families who had followed Takeshi to America, artifacts that had been preserved by people who didn't fully understand their significance, accounts and investments that had been accumulating interest for decades without anyone knowing their connection to the larger network. "More treasure?" Danny asked with a grin. "More responsibility," Eli corrected, but he was smiling too. That evening, they opened the package together, spreading documents across the kitchen table in a scene that had become routine over the past months. This time, the contents were particularly intriguing. Records of a Japanese settlement in California that had maintained its own cultural traditions while contributing to local communities, along with artifacts that clearly matched the style and purpose of what they'd found in Maine. "It's bigger than we thought," Danny said, studying a map that showed potential network sites stretching across the entire continent. Takeshi didn't just create one community, he created a model that other communities copied. Or maybe, Eli suggested, he wasn't the only samurai who chose honor over corruption. Maybe there were others, all working toward the same goal from different directions. The possibility was both exciting and overwhelming. If they were right, the foundation they now managed might be just one part of a much larger legacy network of networks that had been quietly building for 3 centuries, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "Would that change what we're doing?" Danny asked. Eli looked at his son now, 13, taller, more confident, but still carrying the jade amulet that had started their entire adventure. Danny had grown into his role as a guardian naturally, understanding instinctively that their responsibility wasn't just to preserve the past, but to ensure it continued serving the future. "It would expand what we're doing," Eli said, "but the core mission stays the same. Honor Takeshi's sacrifice by making sure his resources continue helping people who need them." Together? Together. As they prepared for bed that night, Eli found himself thinking about the warrior's mask, now displayed in the museum alongside the other artifacts they'd discovered. Sometimes visitors asked why it wasn't behind glass like the rest of the collection, why people were allowed to approach it closely and even touch it if they chose. The answer was simple. The mask had served its purpose. It had been worn when the final choice needed to be made, when the legacy needed protecting and the future needed securing. Now it waited for the next crisis, the next moment when someone would need to put on the face of a guardian and make decisions that would affect generations not yet born. But Eli hoped that moment was far in the future. For now, he was content to be exactly what he'd become, a man who had found his purpose by inheriting someone else's honor, and who had learned that the greatest treasures aren't the ones you find buried in the ground. They're the ones you build with your choices, day after day, until they become the foundation for someone else's dreams. Outside, the memorial stone caught moonlight on its polished surface, marking the spot where a desperate treasure hunt had become something far more valuable. A family's destiny, fulfilled at last, and ready to continue for generations to come. The story of Takeshi Yamamoto was complete, but the story of his inheritors was just beginning.